Hi everyone, welcome to the Spotlight video on Constructivism and Piaget's theory of cognitive development. So let's set the stage. First of all, as Piaget kind of was growing into his life as an academic, behaviorism was really the dominant theory at the time. And as part of this, Piaget was even involved in much of the IQ testing that was going on. And as he was doing many of these assessments, he actually became really kind of irritated with the process and turned off by many of these principles of behaviorism, in that he found that just because a child gave supposedly, quote unquote, an incorrect response, what he was able to determine is that it wasn't necessarily that their thinking was off, but it was more about that they have experienced the world in a different way. And this showed how much he aligned with the ideas of constructivism, that knowledge is actively constructed through the action of the learner, and therefore, based on our experiences with the world, we will construct our understanding and knowledge. So he was much more interested in a child's thinking than a specific response. He would say unpacking a response is really what's going to help you understand their thinking process. So that leads us into constructivist teaching and what he would endorse for teachers in a classroom. And what he said is, every time one prematurely teaches a child something he could have discovered for himself, that child is kept from inventing it and consequently from understanding it completely. And so he would suggest, right, that we need to give children the opportunity and the agency to ask questions, to explore, and then develop their understanding. We first have to activate that prior knowledge and meet students where they're at. So start with what the child knows and then allow them to build on that knowledge. So kind of my question, have you ever heard of Montessori schools? Constructivism is really kind of the driving force in the philosophy of these schools, and that you'll walk into any classroom and kids are doing a variety of different things. They might have a packet or a bin, because whatever they're curious about, they're going to be able and allowed to explore different dimensions of that and kind of at their own pace. So an example of constructivism in the classroom might be, here's an example of a kindergarten math standard to classify objects and count the number of objects in each category. Now, a behaviorist might give a student a worksheet and saying, okay, I need you to classify all of these items by color and count up how many red, how many green, how many blue. Whereas Piaget would say, that's robbing them of a really important experience to go deeper, to be more inductive in this process. And he might say, okay, give them a bin of a bunch of different types of kind of spaghetti, macaroni, and say, hey, figure out some different ways that you can group these, right? And so now they're getting into the idea of kind of being able to classify objects, compare, look at different ways they can do it, and then count up objects. And he would say that would lead to much deeper learning than you kind of setting up some type of worksheet for them. An example of maybe a business ed standard, one of the standards is to develop techniques for making wise consumer decisions, where a behaviorist might have students learn the different strategies, like research-based strategies that can help to make a wise decision. Piaget might say, you know what, I want you to do a project on this. I want you to think about something you've been considering buying or want to purchase in the future. And I want you to think through all of the different decisions you'll make and some different strategies that might be important along the way. And so kind of make it much more inductive, much more centered on what a person's interest might be. So even if you walk into a classroom, you can see if behaviorism is more present or constructivism is more present. So like in a classroom with behaviorism, you might see the teacher more kind of up by a board, or all of the students kind of their attention directed at the teacher because they're the expert in the room. Whereas for Piaget, if you walk into a classroom that's kind of based on more of the principles of constructivism, maybe you don't know what you'll be seeing in there. You might not even be able to identify where the teacher is or who the teacher is, simply because they are more of a facilitator and floater. And instead, it's much more student driven, possibly inquiry based, where students might be working on different things and learning in different ways. So Piaget is probably the most famous for his stages of cognitive development and the qualitative changes that he proposed children go through as they develop. Personally, I think this is the least interesting part of his theory, but it is important to how he understood children. So an example of this is as children move from sensory motor to pre-operational, concrete operational to formal operational over time. Here's an example of how our thinking might change. Like in early childhood, a child might say something like, my favorite animal is a unicorn. and truly believe that unicorns exist and that is their favorite animal, even though they may not have ever seen one. Whereas an elementary age child who's more in the concrete operational stage might say something like, unicorns aren't real. Have you ever seen one at a zoo? No, you have not, because they are not real. So kind of digging much more into kind of concrete situations, kind of pushing away some of that magic and illogical thinking. Whereas a high school student might be even to show much higher kind of even these kind of symbolic or hypothetical situations by saying something like, it is interesting that unicorns are often used as a symbol of beauty, joy, or uniqueness. Okay, so seeing much higher levels of cognitive thinking. Another example, a difference between concrete and the formal operational stage is if you pose the question to kids, what if no one had thumbs? This is actually a great, I encourage you to ask your students. It's kind of funny what they'll come up with. But a child in the concrete operational stage might say, what if we didn't have thumbs? Oh, we wouldn't be able to tell someone good job. Okay, just thinking really concretely, like, what would that mean for my hands? Whereas a student at the formal operational stage might say, wow, everything is designed for thumbs. It would change everything from phones to how we eat to maybe the clothes we wear, how we dress. And so think much more deeper, broader, kind of more abstract scale, showing that changing in thinking. So although not every child will fit in where like their age range is, you might see some, flexibility there. This has been used to think about kind of different stages in the curriculum and when we introduce things and what we should expect at different ages. But Piaget also encouraged us to introduce some cognitive dissonance. So to push students enough so that they're being challenged and they really have to grapple with something. And he said that's a good thing. Right? That disequilibrium is a good thing until we can really figure it out, and then the learning becomes much deeper. And that's really through the process of updating our schemas. And Piaget said this is how we learn. We move from assimilation to accommodation and eventually enter back into equilibrium. And so assimilation is where we are making information we take in through our senses fit with what we already know. Okay, so it might be that a child has a dog and then they see a neighbor's dog that might be a different breed, but, is similar, and they point and they say, oh, that's a dog, right? It's similar to mine, and they're applying something they already know. Whereas maybe they grew up with a dog and all of a sudden they see a neighbor has a cat, but they point at the cat and they say, oh, dog, right? Which makes sense because it's a four-legged animal with hair, and so it might look like that. But then an adult would say, oh, no, that's actually a cat. That's a different type of animal. And then they have to accommodate that information. And then that eventually leads to an equilibrium. Why you might see those kind of variations and kind of how the animal moves and the noises the animal makes, that's a different animal. And then that updates their kind of schematic structure. It happens with my name all the time. People assume that I am a boy because my name is Kyle. So they see my name and they assimilate and they're like, oh, Mr. Miller. Whereas and then they meet me and I'm female presenting. And so it's like they have to then accommodate that information to be like, oh, well, I guess it could go with, different genders. And they accommodate that and then they're back with equilibrium. I saw this, I see this all the time. So look for this in your students. It is kind of funny when they assimilate and it doesn't quite fit and then they have to update that schematic structure. I was watching the show Bluey with my daughter. If you haven't seen it, it's just kind of this cute kids show. But one of my friend's sons, who's in elementary school, came and sat down next to us, and he looked at it and he was listening to the show. And he goes, oh, this show is from England. And I turned to him, I'm like, oh, no, actually, it's from Australia. And he goes, no, it's not. It's from England. And I was like, oh, except it's not. And he goes, look, the steering wheel is on the right side, so it's from England. So what he was doing is he had been to England and he saw that people drove on the other side of the road and the steering wheel was on the other side. So he was assimilating that with what he knew. So this show must take place in England because that's what the car looks like. And they have an accent. But then when I had to, really show him, and he even forced me to show him things online and pictures that, oh, in Australia, it's similar. You'll also hear an accent and they drive on the other side of the road. And so he had to update that like, oh, it's not only England. Other countries also have different driving regulations. An older example might be if you're in a literature class and you learn about different dialects of English. So if you grow up thinking that English is only written or spoken in one way, but then you're confronted with other dialects, ways of speaking, ways of writing, right? That really disrupts what you knew before. And so you then have to accommodate for not only understanding that there are different dialects, but then how you go about reading them and fitting them into your schematic structure. Now, there are lots of limitations to Piaget's theory. Some good stuff, maybe not some good stuff. First of all, he's really heavily criticized for underestimating young children. And we see that a lot. If you were really just to apply those stages, you really might hold a child back and not challenge them enough. But also we have seen that he may have overestimated teens, and that in fact this might not be just a developmental process where you can create kind of cognitive thinking relating to hypotheticals or more abstract thought, but in fact that might just be a product of education and maybe not something that goes on just internally in a child. And number three, that his theory really ignores the role of language in social dimensions. He really thought of it more on a personal level, that children are curious and they might pose questions that they want to explore, and then they learn new material, they move through these qualitative changes, but he didn't think about the social process of learning, which is what we will cover next week with Vygotsky.